We're going to talk about the Hybrid Bodies project, which is showing here in August. But first of all, we thought we'd each just show a few examples of our previous works. In my case, which are very different, my work takes lots of different forms and uses lots of different processes. So I'm just going to talk about one of my very early projects, which was my first real formal collaboration with a scientist. I've titled the talk Art ? Science ? Because I think that, chiming with what Candace was saying really, as you begin to, as I've found anyway, as I've begun to work across these two disciplines, the question marks arise. I mean, what is it that we're actually doing? Is this art? Is this science? Does it matter? Anyway, the first project is from the mid-1990s. It was called After Image. And it really came out of my curiosity. I'd been thinking all of my work, at the core of all of my work, is an interest in looking at what we are as human beings. What does it mean to be human? Thank you. And kind of where does humanness begin and end? And I discovered the phenomenon of the phantom limb, and I wanted to know more about that, so I went out looking for neurologists who could tell me a bit more. And at the same time, the Wellcome Trust in London started giving their first art science grants. So this was wonderful. It meant that I had an excuse to go out and kind of look for scientists and say, look, there's this potential for funding. Would you like to apply for some with me? And so that kind of changed the whole ball game. And I did get people. I got a neurologist and a neuropsychologist who were very keen to work with me. We met in Oxford. We had a 5-hour conversation very excitedly about phantom limbs and other kind of weird neurological phenomena. And then we managed to get some money. But then there were a few little kind of hurdles that had to be worked with, one being that initially the scientists thought that I was going to illustrate their work, and I had to sort of educate them over that what I was trying to do may illustrate their work, but it was more than that. Anyway, I found, partly through them and partly through my own kind of initiative, I found 8 people around England, all of whom have congenital missing limbs, so all of whom have amputations of one sort or another. And I met with them several times, took lots of digital snapshots, and then came up with these series of portraits. And for each person, like you can see Jackie here, I made a portrait of the person as they wanted to be depicted in their home. And in her case, she wanted to be depicted with her wearing her prosthesis. And then Roger here, who wanted to be depicted without his prosthesis. And then I made a series of photographs of each person, including their phantom limb, as they described it to me. And this one's the one that's kind of been shown a lot in both art and science contexts. I won't talk about the project anymore, really, other than to say that this, I mean, for me, the interest really was about asking the question, well, which is the real body? Is it the one that you and I see, the objective body, or is it the one that the person experiences, which includes, in this case, the hand, with no attachment to the arm, and in Jackie's case, a kind of rather weird stick-like arm with a big hand on the end. Yeah, I won't go on and on. I can talk for ages about this, but I won't because we haven't got time. But I'm really partly showing this work to talk about the fact that from a very early stage, really, I became fascinated by people's narratives, the narratives of the participants, patients, subjects, whatever you like to call them. And it really, for me, the collaboration has often been with the people who are these people, rather than with the scientists themselves. The scientists, I mean, there's been a lot of dialogue with the medical scientists involved, but the real work has been with the patients, or whatever you like to call them. I'll go on to another project of a similar time. In this case, I was actually invited to work with a dermatologist at London Hospital. And I went to meet with her. We had lots of talks. She very generously showed me lots of medical photographs. And at that time at the London Hospital, they had a really brilliant medical photographer. And I just thought, this is really interesting because these kinds of skin conditions are, for the people who experience them, really problematic, really painful, and also painful socially. I'll show you a little quote in a minute from a couple of people. But they're also very beautiful in these medical photographs. I found them very beautiful. So I met several of Irene, the dermatologist's patients, again, worked with digital snapshots, and then went out looking for fabrics that could kind of, that the skin could be displayed on or amongst, so as to try and create images that are quite aesthetically pleasing, at the same time as being somehow somewhat difficult. I'll just flick through them quickly. They're displayed next to these texts. I won't read it out, but in scanning the text, you can probably see that the people's experiences are quite painful and quite difficult. And then my experience of working with scientists took a different tangent. When the phantom limb work was shown in London, it won a big prize, and one of the judges of the prize was a medical physicist called Alf Linney, who then came to me and said, actually, it might be quite interesting for us to work together. So we did for 12 years. I mean, that was not exclusively what I did, but we collaborated over 12 years on 3 big projects. The first one called Face Value. Alf's speciality is the face, and he works, for example, as an expert witness for the police on facial recognition and on facial reconstruction. So in going to his workshops, thinking about our common interests, and again, relating to what Candace was saying, pursuing our common sense of curiosity, we started thinking about how we all judge one another by appearance, and came up eventually with this kind of face reading machine. So you sit down, this is at the Exploratorium in San Francisco that it was first shown, and it was kind of semi-commissioned by them as well. So it had to be a piece that was very user-friendly, and robust. So you sit down in front of a monitor, your face is you line up you see this face, which is an average of 60 different people. You line up your face with it, you press a button, that's Alf, and your face is captured. The measurements of your features are kind of calculated by the piece, and then a little ticket's printed out with your supposed character on it. I mean, the idea of the piece is not that to say, you know, this is true, we're genuinely reading your face, but it's to get people talking, which is why it's printed out on a little ticket. And it did that. I mean, it's quite fascinating. Even I, who's designed the piece, found it quite interesting, you know, to sit and see what does the machine say about me today. And people love kind of seeing themselves and, interacting with the machine in that way. I mean, it's quite a primitive interaction. And there was another part to the work. So there we were looking at the static features of the face. Then we went on to another piece where we were looking at facial expressions. So again, you sit down in front of a screen, but this time it's more like a mirror. I'll play. So as I was saying, in this case, you don't have to do anything. You just sit in front of the screen and your image is captured. I mean, it's all very old technology, but at the time, it was quite innovative in that we could classify facial expressions quite well. On an untutored system, the teeth needed, I think, the teeth were replaced after this, pretty awful. But the face was texture mapped onto the model, and then the model warped to look like each person that's sitting in front of it. I'll just let you see how it textures to her. Can we ask questions? Yeah, why not?
So you mentioned that there's a classification of facial expressions.
Yeah.
Where does the classification show?
Sorry, where was it? What?
Where does it show the classification? You mentioned that there was some classification.
No, we classified expressions so as to enable this to happen. I mean, you don't see, as a user, you don't see that. That's all kind of hidden away in the program, yeah. Oh God, I can't work with this not mirrored screen. My help. Okay, so how do I go back into?
Let's just change it so you. Well, it's too late now, but.
No, up. There. Okay, we'll go here. Yeah. So lastly, I've realised I'm probably taking a bit too much time, but this is the last piece that Alf and I made together when he moved from a department that focused on the face to somewhere called the Ear Institute, which focuses on hearing, a research institute into hearing. So we made this language-based piece called Conversation Piece, where the idea is that there are these little talking points on plinths, and as you walk up to the plinth, you hear a voice talking to you. We were using directional speakers so that if you're standing in exactly the right place, the voice sounds as though it's coming from inside your head. Now I bet this won't play either, will it? Yay.
Are you an artist? You have such a good sense of style.
I'm not a professional, I'm just an amateur student studying some music in spare time.
Okay, sorry, I was only asking. Don't take it as an insult. I think artists are pretty cool people, actually.
Oh yes, I think they are great people.
So what you're seeing is...
Haven't you heard of the art of conversation?
No, I have not.
A kind of pseudo-artificial intelligence.
Quite hard work at times. But it depends who I'm talking to, of course. Speak up, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Some people really dress up to come here. Yesterday there was a woman here in an amazing dress. It looked a bit like a wedding dress. It was white and lacy with a long train.
Well, I'm not wearing a wedding dress.
She was also carrying an overnight bag. I get the feeling you don't believe me.
I do believe you.
I just have to learn to expect the unexpected.
I think you speak in a quite unexpected fashion.
I said I just have to learn to expect the unexpected.
Oh yes.
Do you like surprises?
Yes, I do like surprises.
What really surprises you?
That I think I'm talking to a computer, but the computer can sing. You can.
Aren't you bored with a life with no surprises? Well,
yes.
I'm a bit bored with you now. Anyway, so I will say goodbye now.
So it's really all about, I don't know if you get the sense from this very quick kind of introduction, but the idea is that there's an array of microphones in the plinth which are hearing what the person using the piece is saying. And then that's going into a tree structure, and it's selecting various responses based on whether it actually recognises what he's saying or doesn't, and kind of guesses. So the conversations can flow nicely, or they can become quite random. But what's really interesting is the extent to which people try and keep the conversation going and kind of invest in it. So in a way, it's a kind of performance piece. I'll skip that one. Oh. skip that one. So it's really about there are kind of two layers of audience. One is the people interacting with it, and the other one is the people watching the people interacting. So in that, yeah, I'm quite interested in that as well. So now I'll pass over to Andrew and let him talk about his work a bit, and then we'll talk about the project which is going to be shown downstairs.
It's very nice to be here and to see everybody, and I hope this is the beginning of a kind of conversation that goes on over the next few days. So I see this as a kind of opportunity to introduce a little bit of past work and see where we go with it. I teach at Southampton University, who has an art school, but I started my studies doing science originally, and did 2 years before a drive to kind of make art took over. So I had a little bit of a background in it that a number of years later came back. I think I did kind of 10 years, well, I did about 6 years in art school and then about 10 years of practice, and then suddenly the science that I had been doing crept back into the work, was recognized by people that came and visited the studio, and it was taken up as a kind of, as a way forward, which I followed, kind of making other work at the same time. But it's kind of very interested, I'm very interested in a sense of what Alexa's talking about how we see ourselves now through science, and about the kind of embodiment that that means and that gives us, and how we view it. And I think there was a kind of strange sense that started, and this makes reference to the topic. When I was about 8 or 9, I think it was 8, I discovered with a friend a brain under a bush at school. It was a bit of an odd experience. It was pink, and it was all wrinkly and strange and quite large enough. And so we thought, who has lost their brain? How can that happen? And we struggled, this friend and I, with that dilemma for some time. And it was never really resolved. It just faded away. All I can think now that it was a very, very large piece of masticated chewing gum. And this slide kind of reminds me of that. This is a very ancient piece of chewing gum from Finland, about 5,000 years old, gum from a tree that's chewed. But it's those kinds of things that I now find. There was another thing with trees and dendritic form in my childhood that you find inform the kinds of work that you do and the kinds of interests that you have. I'm not going to tell that story, but I think it's very significant in terms of this project. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of projects, how they came about, and some of the kind of background to things, and how it's operated and how it works. So I was making a kind of a lot of work in the studio. It was recognized by a curator that came to see other types of work, saw what I was doing, and I got caught up in a project. Again, in the UK, the Wellcome Trust has been very strong in driving things, and it was a project that the Wellcome Trust were running, a project called Head On, which was exhibited in the Science Museum. And so I've been making work, not as long as Alexa, but about 15, 16 years in the kind of area, in different ways. And it's not been all of my work, but it's been central. And I think over that period, I've probably done a project, 1 or 2 per year, working with scientists in different ways and collaborating. Yeah, I say collaborating. I say collaborating in a sense for me too easily, because I think it's about a dialogue. I mean, a true collaboration would be a situation where I actually worked with a scientist to make the work. And what it's often been is a kind of a talk with somebody about their work and a long interest. I mean, the scientists that I made Magic Forest with, I mean, it was made in 2002. This conversation has gone on ever since then with them in different kinds of ways and different kinds of formats. And it was with this, and this is Richard Wingate and his lab. It was very nice because one of the things that happened, I started the conversations with Richard. I found him accidentally going to see another scientist. I was speaking to the other scientist, and he said, really, you need to be speaking to Richard down the corridor. And I went, and we've established this kind of long-term relationship. The piece also involved other conversations, and I think the interesting thing for me is it involved conversations with the lab and things that Richard did. And Richard is basically a developmental neurologist looking at how the brain is formed and structured, and basically he switches on and off genes to misdirect the neurons going into place so he can see what's happening, and he makes short moves like this with that. So basically these are the neurons tracking, and what he's interested in is when the neurons get lost. And these are neurons that are moving in a gradient in the developing brain in a chicken that have got lost. So that's why their trajectory is not straight. They're all over the place. He now knows that a particular gene, he switched off a particular gene, and he now knows that that's critical at that place. Yes?
That's in vivo or in vitro?
In a petri dish, yeah. Sorry, it's my brain.
Minimal cultures.
So it's a cultured, yeah, outside the brain. And, we had long conversations, and it was very interesting. And what's really interesting is that his interest with me then spread into the rest of the lab, in a sense, and his postgraduate students took up the idea of working with artists, working with all sorts of kind of age groups and people. So it wasn't just this connection with me, it spread out into lots of conversations, which were really important. And for me also it involved kind of looking down, and one of the things that triggered the relationship with Richard and an ongoing relationship, that he was interested in early cinema, and he was very interested in Cajal, Ramon Cajal, the Spanish histologist, basically. And it's very interesting in a way that both of us picked up on it from different sides. Obviously, he's a very important scientist in terms of mapping the brain at that period. He won the Nobel Prize, had a fight on stage with Golgi because they disagreed about how the brain was constructed. But one of the significant things I always thought about Cajal was that, in a sense, he was almost an artist and always continued photography throughout his life. But there's a way with his drawings that are fascinating and very beautiful, constructed. And it was from all this work. So it's from Richard and his labs and his videos, the historical work of Golgi and Cajal feeding forward, and Richard's working with green fluorescent proteins, staining the neurons and being able to track them through a confocal microscope. But it involved also other excursions to see other scientists, and one of the other people I saw and spoke to quite a lot was an Eleanor Maguire at Queen's Square in the cognitive department there, and she was doing work about mapping and the hippocampus. And what was significant about that, with when she tested taxi drivers about the size of their hippocampus, that she found that they were very large, and this is the mapping center of the brain. And this was versus, and taxi drivers in London have to know a lot of routes. It takes, 5-6 years to learn the knowledge to become a black cab taxi drivers. Whereas in bus drivers only ever know 2 or 3 routes in London. And she found significant differences between the size of the hippocampus. And this wasn't just something that they were innately given, larger hippocampuses. That area developed. So there was a sense that the brain changed. And going back to my history, when I was about 16, 17, I was told by a local kind of scientist, oh, your brain is fixed. It's like solid, like a brick. It's all wired. And what I was then interested in was, in a sense, that the wiring was flexible, that it was changing, that it was altering. So I made a piece, and it doesn't film very well, so all I've got is stills of it. A piece called Magic Forest, which is a slide dissolve work, which transitions from images of the skull and working through, and it's developed in this kind of system with 2 projectors on either side of voil screens, and I've used this kind of system quite a lot for exploring work. But what it gave a feel of is like being in the brain, because the screens actually kind of move as you move through it, so it's very 3-dimensional, very sculptural. And these are kind of shots, and on one side you can see the projector, and the little dot on the other side is the projector, so it dissolves between them. So it's old-fashioned slide projection systems. And this is basically studio kind of how it operates. I work digitally, but then move out to write with a laser graphic machine to slide film and then project it. And that's been quite interesting. I've moved into kind of video and other work since. But for me, it's been all of those kind of interested about how the technology of the time also changed. I mean, one of the things that was really important for me at that time was that it was the age of dumping of analog material. And all of the equipment I could get on eBay was extraordinary in terms of projection. I could not do video was taking off, but I couldn't do the same things. I could never afford like 4 wide-angle lenses and 4 projectors. But suddenly, all the AV companies, especially in America, were dumping all of this equipment dissolved units, and that was very significant for me in that way. And these are just some shots of the final piece, which is quite interactive, quite move-through kinds of piece. And you get this shimmering, and it ends almost with a kind of stroke. And again, that kind of biographical bit comes in. So there was something that triggered an interest in trees with me. My mother was a botanist. My mother died within months of me completing it, of a stroke. So it seemed like a natural end to the piece, that all of the neurons collapsed and disappeared. But again, so that's a highly personal thing. I was just going to try and talk about some issues, and these slides were just to remind me kind of what I thought of talking about it. It strikes me over the 16 projects that I've done, I've worked in many different ways. And I've worked directly with people, and with Richard I used to go in the lab, work alongside him. Other times it's just been kind of glancing. I've only had maybe 1 or 2 conversations with a scientist about a project, maybe because they were too busy, or not open enough, or something, and that often happens. That the scientists giving time. I mean, it was one of the very lucky things about working with Richard, and I think with Alexa, with Alf, the amount of time that they gave to the project and the willingness. And I met lots of other younger scientists that were just really dedicated on their work. They would give bits of time. So it's very varied, and sometimes it's been working with people that suffer from different conditions, and that's also been very generous at times, and quite harrowing at times, working with actual patients suffering with epilepsy or autism. That's another conversation about how we sit, and that's kind of an interesting thing, I think, about how the kinds of work that we make then fit within the mainstream. That's the kind of conversation. And I've already said this thing about, is it collaboration? I always felt with Richard and a lot of the other people I've made work from their work and around, and with talking with them, it's always me that's receded to the studio and made work. And nobody else other than me would be stupid enough to do what I do, in a sense. I mean, Magic Forest and all the slides took me 6 months, 3 days a week of just drawing on the computer, getting it all right and setting it up. And there's no scientist that would collaborate and engage in that kind of work. And that's often been true with a lot of the projects I've done. I'm also, and this is kind of personal, and this is this kind of diversity of approaches. For me, it's always been making a work of art in a way. It's not conjoined as yet. I would love that opportunity, but it has been me kind of driving things. And that's been the result of making the work in such an intense and long period, really. It takes a lot of time to make work. Scientists aren't going to give you that time. And it's in the making that the mistakes and the errors that turn it into something kind of interesting happen. I had no idea when I started what I would end up with. So that was quite interesting. And it's driven, in a sense, in differentials, and these are very difficult. The politics of kind of money in this kind of area is really difficult. Who's funded and who's not. And often we've actually been in a strange situation where things have been altered in terms of money at times, but there's often the labs have got big money, they've got time, and what you're trying to do is drive your work. And I lecture teach in an art school a couple of days a week. Then I'm meant to keep up with the science, and I'm meant to make work. It makes for a struggle, and the funding is often quite difficult to do that. So there are these differentials. And this was just a kind of, in a sense, a plug. I mean, it's like working with scientists, but I think artists are it's really interesting to think that artists could work with lots of people, or anybody. I feel like I could work with somebody working on an allotment and growing leeks. It seems to me I was also brought up in a period when art world was quite reductive, in a sense, and very narrow, and the art was completely separated, and I completely believe it should be linked with other people and other ways. And in the UK, certainly one of my great frustrations in teaching in an art school is that we create so many art students, and they're brilliant, but they fail to find a role in the community because they're not successful. But I do think that people should be placed with all sorts of people, work in factories. I think we're kind of great lubricators in a way, and set up great kind of conversations. And always that's what's been core to it, in a sense, is those conversations that happened with Richard, spread out into his lab and to other people. And I do believe it's often a great waste with our young people, in a sense, and very sad, really. I don't know how much to run through these, but there are other works, and they've worked. I mean, I pulled up these works in a sense because they were working with other scientists and other kinds of frustrations about how things set up. One thing I would say is that all the scientists I've ever phoned, basically, and asked about would they help me, have helped me, without almost exception. And the only time that it didn't well, 2 times that it didn't work out. One was completely understandable, because his wife just had a stroke, and that was, you know, a real massive changing of his life, and we just started a conversation, and then it ended. And another one over this project, and this was with Simon Baron-Cohen, who's an expert on autism. And I don't know why it didn't happen. It just didn't. I've had one other problem about the specificity of something with the scientists as well, that I wanted for effect a picture of spongy bone. And I went to see him about it, and I told him what I was doing. I was focusing on the skull and how it worked, and I just wanted a picture. I wanted to go on a journey that went through this kind of spongy bone. And he said, oh, no, there's no spongy bone in the brain. You can't have an image of that. So I had to go and find someone for somewhere else. Though I'm sure if you look in the kind of very surface, to me that's spongy bone. I mean, it's a kind of structured, but I don't know. I believe him. He was the expert. He didn't give me the picture. So that was it. But this was an interesting project because I eventually talked to a number of scientists on this project on autism. It's called Dark Garden, Wired in a Different Way. And it was very interesting because I found very contradictory information about the topic of autism. And in fact, they'd all been the teachers of Simon Baron-Cohen. And in a way they said, oh no, he's completely wrong. His theory about the male brain and it all being about maleness and the endocrinology of it, and that it's a kind of massive kind of bump up of testosterone that changes the brain, that makes the autistic brain, you know, that's kind of wrong, and we believe differently. So I found it a very difficult project because I got lots of different points of view and didn't know how to work with it. So again, it became a very kind of embodied kind of way of working. And for this piece, I didn't really work with any patients. Large projection piece. They tended to be very silent. They're driven by the sound of the projectors and the silence and that click and that expectation. I see the piece as a very, I don't expect people to necessarily understand any of the science that's kind of depicted in its root, but I think there's a kind of engaging space, and if people inquire, then they get a feel about things. And it was very much about proliferation, the closed downness of some autistic people, the notion of islands of expertise, all sorts of things that were about that came out in the sequential side, ordering and bringing together, collecting things together. This piece, and this is the last bit that I'm going to talk about, Seized Out of This World, was about epilepsy. And again, on this project, I worked with a number of different scientists looking at temporal lobe epilepsy. And at this point, it was quite interesting because this is an occasion where a neuropsychologist came to me. He basically spoke about, I mean, we'd known each other for a while, and he came to an exhibition, and he was on the verge of kind of moving over from being a neuropsychologist and doing quite a lot of writing. And he said, oh, do you know about temporal lobe epilepsy? It's kind of a very interesting kind of topic because of it's connected with writers, particularly writing and creativity in a way, and that this kind of very focused area in the temporal lobes of this epilepsy that happens and the kind of attacks that they get has something to do with visions and everything, and you might be interested in it. So it was him that suggested it, and then in a way that was a kind of interesting topic then to kind of get involved in, because it kind of crossed. Right, and so this was Paul Brock's, and he wrote a very interesting book, Into the Silent Land, which is his medical recounting what his experiences. And again, what does the science do in terms of making us human and give us that understanding? And another expert on epilepsy, Adam Zeman. And I talked to both of them, and on this occasion, I talked to quite a lot of patients about their condition. And that was strange and harrowing, because again, you have to tread carefully, I think, with people, because certainly one of the people I was talking to, the effect of the drugs on the condition were quite strong, and in a way it took away her creativity. And basically, previously when she'd had creative times and she was a painter, she had somebody that guided her through her creative work. Basically, she described it as having somebody sitting on her shoulder, somebody out of body telling her what to do. And when she was on the medication, she lost that. I bring up these pictures because this is from Alice in Wonderland. And Dodson, the writer, is basically a confirmed epileptic. So one of the descriptions of epilepsy and one of the conditions in Gershwin syndrome is to feel that you get very large or very small. And of course that's what Alice does. She gets very large and very small. So some of the traits that come out, it's probably the best description of what Vincent van Gogh and his creative urge went through, that he was an epileptic as well, temporal lobe epilepsy. And some of the other parts of Gershwin syndrome is hyper-religiosity. He was very hyper-religious when he was in the Belgian coalfields. He was very like that. He also suffered, in a sense, from hypergraphia, wrote a lot. And again, that is part and connected with the condition. And this kind of external, out-of-body kind of experience that I've kind of mentioned from this patient that I spoke to had and lost because of the medication. And she was very worried about the situation that she was in. She didn't know, and in a way she didn't want to be medicated, but she knew she was struggling if she was. And I made a work, there's other aspects of it about repetition and déjà vu and jamais vu that underline the condition. And I made a large slide projection piece that was quite dreamy, was on 3 sets of screens, that basically took a body and took it through these different kind of conditions in a way, and this representing these different things. So it was in 3 sections and had 3 different chapters going on. And you as a viewer don't quite know where you are, because it would seem on a different set of screens that the project was starting again, but it would go off in a different route. So I tried to build into it these kinds of feelings about the condition. And, you know, basically a structure. This is just glimpses. Sometimes you can see the layers and the way that it works through. And I think that's it. Good. So that's my section on an introduction. Alexa's going to come back and talk about the Hybrid Bodies project, and then we're both going to respond a little bit to how we made work through that.
So I'll just talk through a little bit of the structure of the project that's given rise to the work that we're going to be showing here in the summer. The whole project was started by Heather Ross, a Canadian cardiologist, and her 2 hypotheses are here. But basically, she noticed in her work that, and this was has been very contentious in Canada, that her heart transplant patients weren't adapting as well as people would like to think, emotionally and psychologically, to taking on somebody else's organ. So this core team, the scientific team, which already included a philosopher, the British philosopher Margaret Sheldrake, who it was she and Pat McKeever actually who invited Andrew and I to participate, and then we invited 2 Canadian artists as well. They were already working visually, which to me is really interesting, that their study is a series of, well, they have somebody interviewing people who've received organs, and the study is a video study where they're looking at the discrepancy between what people say, how people say they are, and what their body language is saying. So they're research questions, basically. How do heart transplant recipients perceive their hearts, their bodily integrity and their personal identity? How do they imagine and speak about their donors? How do these perceptions, thoughts and accounts change over time? And is there a relationship between these perceptions and physical and mental outcomes of their transplant? So that's the scientific team. These are the 4 artists, and as you've already seen, Andrew and I work in very different ways, and Catherine and Ingrid work in yet different ways again. And we were all, partly for geographical reasons, Ingrid's in Montreal, Catherine's in Ottawa, I'm in London, and Andrew's in Southampton. So we all worked individually on pieces that respond to the scientists' work. And this is, we're not allowed to show you any of the actual footage, and I'm actually not sure I'm really allowed to show you this, but anyway, this is a still from one of the videos. And you can see here the patient saying something quite positive: I would be dead, but it's fine now, I'm completely different, I can do anything I want. And as he's saying that, he's looking down and he's kind of doing this. And so he's physically, his language is contradicting what he's saying verbally. And likewise this guy, look at his posture. And he's contradicting himself. Life's fantastic, but I feel like I've been through a war. So the narratives are quite contradictory. And this is how the project, the research is kind of carried out. Every July we go and spend a few days sitting in this room in Toronto General Hospital. There's members of the team watching the videos and analysing them. The project, we've been working together as a team for about 7 years. And for the first 3 of those years, the scientists were very suspicious of us. And it turned out, I think it was actually in this meeting, things became a little explosive, and it turned out that a couple of them were wondering what our role was, why were we there, were we just going to come and take their data and kind of go away and do something unethical with it, what was happening. So we organised this sort of showing of our previous works. I think you showed work in progress, didn't you? And the rest of us showed previous works in YY's Egg Gallery in Toronto. And we invited the science team. We also opened it up to the public by invitation, and particularly to those people affected by transplant, so donor families, recipients' families, and so on. And this, we had an evening at the top. This is a photograph of an evening we held where each of us gave a presentation on our work to the scientists. And this was a really transformative moment. The atmosphere at the beginning of the evening was quite kind of cold and terse. By the end of the evening, you could see these light bulbs going on in their heads. By the end of the evening, they suddenly realised what the point of us was. And we were absolutely then included. Since then, we've been absolutely included in their research, to the extent that, I'll talk about that. To the extent that now, when we go to analyse videos with them, it's as though there's no art-science boundary. The scientists are listening to our interpretations just as much as they're listening to one another. So that really worked. Actually bringing them into our world, if you like, and showing them why we do what we do. We then had another work-in-progress exhibition in Montreal, open to a general public, and actually this was less than a year after the last meeting, and this really demonstrates how then we had the scientists kind of on board, that they, pretty much all of the team, invested in travelling from Toronto to Montreal to come to this show and to speak with us at various public events. And here we all are, the whole team. I've put everybody's attributions above so you can see us. I always liked this slide because the cardiologist has a red halo. So we've done kind of public talks together, and increasingly we're talking about Ingrid, one of the artists, and Jennifer, the sociologist, recently spoke together in a very collaborative way. So we're talking more and more about how we can give presentations together that are cross-disciplinary, where we're really not talking about disciplinary boundaries anymore. This is the first showing of the works that are going to come here in the PHI Centre in Montreal. I mean, very much arranged for that space. I think it's going to look very different here, which we need to talk about later in the week. Ingrid made a video piece. She's interested in dance, in interpreting the recipient's experience through dance. Through embodied process. Andrew will talk about his in a moment. Catherine got really caught up with all these kind of votive offerings that patients bring to the cardiologist. And so she made these 3D photographs and has now made a 3D video piece where she's looking at the kind of narratives of the gift. And I made a sound installation because, as you may have gathered from my previous works, I'm very interested still in people's personal narratives. And I'm interested in how people, particularly heart transplants recipients, conceive of the self-other boundary, and what happens when you literally receive the heart of another into your body. I mean, that's kind of, in a way, quite revolutionary in thinking about the boundaries of the self and kind of community and so on. So this piece combines narratives of a literal physical exchange of hearts with narratives of emotional exchange of hearts in intimate relationships. And it works, the way that it works is as you walk up to a jacket, it's got IR distance sensors in front, and that triggers a narrative to start. And my idea was that, oh, sorry. Okay, I'm talking about, I've missed, yeah. My idea was that, hopefully this will, it's a little idea.
You become more adjusted, and then you know the heart is there, even though you can't feel it. It's an organ, it works. It's better than the damaged one I had before. And life goes on.
I hadn't even considered that
The
things might
heart
turn out
is
like that.
at the core
I
of
thought,
you.
why was this visited
The
on him
scar
and not
is
me?
healed
There was
and
no
it's not visible,
rational
so-
explanation for his death. He didn't choose it. There is a time to
I
die
felt
that
we
is justifiable
connected
in some
lots of
cases,
ways,
but
intellectually and physically, and
So you get the idea from that the idea is that there are lots of different narratives that kind of converge so that you get this sense of intimacy in the space, but you don't, if there are lots of people in the space, you're not necessarily listening to one narrative from beginning to end. However, it has worked that. This is shown in a different space, but it tends to be that people stand and get caught up with one narrative at a time and stand in kind of pressed area against the jackets and listen to that one narrative. So in a way, I'd like to set the work up a bit differently here so as to encourage people to perform a bit differently in it. And then there's a second piece called Cadenza, which has this wall text and also just very simply, really, 3 beating hearts. Oops. Oh, is that not going to beat? Which are made up from one time when we visited Toronto, I was allowed into the morgue to photograph explanted hearts, the kind of removed dead hearts. And here I've reanimated one of those in different ways. Sorry, this is on a loop. So the 3 hearts beat to different rhythms, and obviously none of them look very natural. So, yeah, it's just, you can see what it's about. Okay, let's pass back to Andrew. I did miss out this slide, sorry, just to say that we're now going on with the same team to a second study. And this is us in the room again for the new study. Okay.
Getting through it. Yeah, just kind of reflecting on what Alexa said. It's been transformational, the relationship with the team. I think the soft scientists, the philosophers and the sociologists welcomed us on board and wanted us on board. The hard team, especially when they were having real difficulty finding funding, found it really difficult to be on board. And in fact, as a result, they were finding the funding difficult to get. They made an application without having the ethics approval in for us. And then it took, when they got their funding, it then took us a separate year to get that ethical approval before we came on board. And, yeah.
It took 3 years for us to get permission just to watch the videos
Yeah.
in the hospital.
And this is because in Canada they have, one of the important things there is they have complete confidentiality about where the heart comes from and who it has. It sometimes doesn't mean a lot, But that's the law, and so ethical approval, I mean, when we look at the videos, we're locked in a room, basically. The hard drives are brought in, we see them, and there is this real strong kind of sense that this is, you know, delicate material that we're looking at. And it is, in a sense, quite extraordinary material. The differences and the signals and the signs are slow, but as Alexa's saying, when we watch them, we now seem to be deeply involved. And some of our comments about the films are looked at. I remember in the last one, we're looking at the donor families, and there was a woman that lost her son. And there was a very interesting point that I noticed, that there was a complete change in her attitude to the interview when she realized that she wasn't going to find anything out about where the heart had come from. In a sense, that's why she participated so much, in a sense, at the beginning, and she's waiting, and then she asks quite directly, you know, or some very leading questions about who was it? Who is it that's received my son's heart? And, you know, the interviewer quite clearly says, I'm not allowed to tell you. The whole nature of the interview changed after that body language, and actually the scientists didn't seem to have noticed that, but we as participants in that whole process can point these things out, so we're kind of very engaged in that, which is kind of really interesting. And the conversations and the reactions are ones that are shared, and it's quite intense, very interesting. Right, so I was just going to talk very briefly really about my response to the sessions and the way that I've worked in it. I just draw when I'm in the sessions. I sit and I draw and I listen, and I don't know kind of quite what I'm going to do. But after a couple of sessions there, I almost set up a kind of outline of a figure, and I started drawing onto them. These are slightly more refined drawings that came afterwards, but they're very similar to the ones that I would do in the sessions. So I would hear things, I would jot them down. And then I went on to make the work a change of heart, looking at scientific things. Oh, and here's something that was quite interesting. Originally, when we showed work to the scientists, when we got a frosty response, I showed them things like the piece that you've just seen, seized with the naked figures and the bodies, which is very much a medical body, medicalized body. It's not sexualized, it's just very straightforward image. The chief person said, "Oh, you're not going to make any work like that, are you?" It struck me cold. I was kind of like, what? You're all doctors, you deal with the body all the time. Surely this is just commonplace. But she was very scared, and I realized afterwards she's very protective of the patients and worried that it would upset them. I don't know quite why, but I'd ignored it. And I just felt that I had to carry on with the work that I wanted to. So I was looking at things like Rembrandt's painting, the surgery, these other kind of medical models as a starting point for my video. And you can see in the drawing I've got these upright figures, and this is where it came from. And I made this very large, slow projection piece. And it's all about transition. The bit that I was interested in the project is about boundaries and about the lack of boundaries that happen, about this alteration, about who people think they are. When you get, one of the interviews was of an Indian gentleman, a Hindu, and what I understand is that death is a heart death, it's not brain death. So what happens, and how does he feel when he gets a transplanted heart from another person? In a sense, he effectively, religiously wise, thinks that he's dead, but he's alive. And it's these kind of boundaries and other things about personality changes. The things that crop up in the kind of conversations are minimal, but you do get it, the kind of interests. You get somebody saying, "Oh, I haven't changed." But then a little bit later on, he says, "Oh, I've suddenly got a fascination in shoes. I'm always looking in the windows of shoe shops, and ladies' shoes particularly interest me." What do these things, this transplant, what does it do? I mean, there was another man that was interviewed, and he talks about my heart. This is a good heart. This is a young heart. This is a female heart. It's a woman's heart. Well, he doesn't know, and the team do know. No, it's not. It's a male heart. But what does the very fact that they've had this implant, that they think it's a female heart, do to them in the world and how they react to the world? So even if there isn't any, neuron nerve things, because people have postulated that there are nerves in the heart that are very similar to those in the brain, but just the fact that this is keyed into and given over with this process, the fact that there might be changes, then in a sense stimulates changes of thought and thought patterns. So anyhow, A Change of Heart just came out of kind of breaking these boundaries. It's a HD video projection onto screens, and it's shone onto a black voile screen that shimmers just in front of the wall, gives a very kind of eerie, and it just transforms and moves. And one of the things that was really important about it was this show at YYZ, and it's when some of the people that had been transplanted came there and saw the work, and it's when scientists realized that it opened up conversations that the interviews just didn't open up. Conversations. Nurses came from the heart transplant team, and suddenly other discussions were going on. So it was the point at which the artwork was a point around which all these new conversations came. And I won't forget, actually, there were these little kind of feet on the chest. And it wasn't out of an interview with this particular person that came, but her description of the pain that she had suffered before the transplant came. And she described it, and I was behind them as they sat and watched with her husband. And she said, there, that's the gorilla that used to stand on my chest before the operation. So it was quite interesting, those things, and lots of people talking as these floating figures that are in the background, the other, this constant presence of the other, and this constant presence of where the transplant has come from, kind of fed into this work, and it just circles, moves on very slowly. It lasts about 20 minutes. So I thought I'd miss this piece out. I'm going to miss this piece out. There's another piece that just kind of got triggered by, I was very interested in. It's quite a female team. I'm the only male in the team. Is that right? Oh no, except for the interview, Oliver. But for the artists, anyhow, I was quite interested in this protectiveness and this talk. And of course, so I used the nudity and whatever and this nakedness as a model. And it was really interesting because I then became quite forward, and I asked some of the patients what they felt about it. And they were very accepting about it. One of them basically said, it's got to be like that. That's how we are. When we go for our operation, we don't feel like anything. We are very naked. We are very exposed in this whole process. Yeah. So, and going on. So I made that piece, and I'm just going to finish. I made another piece which was a response to this piece of soap that I found in an R&B place that we were staying in, and it was quite organ-like, and I liked the tenderness, and I kept hearing talk of the immunosuppressants and the need after the operation to be very clean. And I was also aware in the production of all of the work by all of the artists, it was quite video-orientated and whatever, and I wanted to make something that was kind of more physical and kind of more of an experience. And so taking this soap and its organ-like kind of feel and the feeling of tenderness when you wash your hands and hold the soap, I then went on and made some soaps that fitted in and hung in a kind of restroom at the Phi, and that people could use. And they're actually hearts within hearts. So you're washing away, and I like this idea of washing away something and then finding something else inside. And they hung, and then they were used as people kind of left the washrooms. And I think that's where I end. Good.